to week 13 of English 121. This week, we're going to be talking about myth in poetry, and we're going to talk a little bit about the ancient Greek poet Sappho's poetry. You'll read chapter 25 on myth and narrative, and you'll do a close reading project on Sappho, and that's for your reflection journal. And due to the fact that we lost a day this week for Veterans Day, there is no conversation due this week. So all you need to do is do the reading, listen to this lecture, and do your reflection journal. So let's talk a little bit about myth and narrative. Myth is a story. It can be an ancient story or a modern story whose actions symbolize some profound truth about human existence. Often, it's used in poetry to really enhance the meaning of a poem, to give it a more universal appeal. But sometimes it's also that poets use myth as a way of rewriting the myth, as a way of giving a different slant on it. For example, H.D. Hilda Doolittle wrote a poem called Helen, which is found on page 910. And in this poem, she's rewriting the idea of Helen. And as you probably remember, Helen in Greek mythology was considered to be the most beautiful woman in the world. She was the daughter of a mortal, Leda, and her abduction, she was abducted, and her abduction really set off the start of the Trojan War. And she was kind of blamed for the Trojan War happening because of her beauty. The Greeks couldn't resist her. So let's look at Hilda Doolittle's poem. It was written in 1924. Helen. All Greece hates the still eyes in the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands, and the white hands. All Greece reviles the wan face when she smiles, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. Greece sees, unmoved, God's daughter, born of love, the beauty of cool feet and slenderous knees. Could love indeed the maid, only if she were laid white ash amid funeral cypresses. So she's retelling the myth and showing Helen as really in her ashen state. And it's important to look at how she's retelling the story because she's trying to make us look differently at how Helen is perceived by Greek culture. There's another version of the Helen myth from Edgar Allan Poe, and that's found on page 910 to 911. That's called To Helen. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, way-worn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. And that's on page 911. This was written almost 100 years earlier in 1831. And it seems to be that Poe is using the idea of Helen as a way to address his own beloved. How is Poe using Helen differently than H.D.? And how do these two versions of the mythic women really differ? There's some other examples of retelling of myths. There's Anne Sexton's Cinderella on page 918. And this is not your classic Disney Cinderella story that you're going to be reading about. I suggest you read it and really think through how is she presenting a different version of Cinderella. And it's actually a lot more like the classic Cinderella from the Grimm brothers. It's a little bit more gruesome, I guess it would be the word. But hers was written in 1971, so please look through that and look at, compare it to your perception of Cinderella. And also, William Butler Yeats talks about Leda and the Swan. That's found on page 821, and he's retelling the myth of Leda and Zeus and how Helen was made. So it's a really interesting retelling of a myth. But I want to go back and look at, besides looking at myth and poetry, I want to talk a little bit in depth about Greek poetry and the inheritance that Greek poetry has given us, especially from the poet Sappho. One of the things that Sappho introduced, especially that was used a lot by the modern poets, by the Roman poets, and then again by modernist poets at the turn of the century, was called phraseological adaptation. And what that means is taking a phrase and refiguring it by alluding to it and then emulating it. That means alluding to it and then changing it to meet your own needs. So in Homer's classic myth, in Homeric myth, the idea that this is from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Previously, only heroes of Homeric myth were thought to be equal to the gods, and that's isos theosin. And whenever there was a great hero, say someone who fought in the Trojan War, he would be considered equal to the gods, isos theosin. But no one ever used it for anything else before Sappho. But in Sappho's poetry, she looks at her beloved and says, "He seems to me equal to the gods, that man, whoever he is, who opposite you sits and listens close to your sweet speaking." So she's looking at her beloved, and her beloved is sitting next to a man, and he, the man is now her beloved's lover, and she thinks that man must be equal to a god to be able to be with her love, because her love is so great. Anyone who's seated next to her beloved is not only divinely happy, but in the presence of something to which men should accord the highest possible value. And so by adapting this phrase, equal to the gods, to a situation that involves love rather than war, she's totally changed, she's emulated, she's really adapted what Homer was saying and made it work for what she wanted to say. It's similar to how, this is whenever I teach this to, I like to teach this lesson when I teach poets in the schools to high school kids. And whenever I bring this up, a good way to think about it, the example I use is whenever people remix songs, so they use a sampling from like a Police song, and from the 1970s or 1980s, and they use a little piece of it and reuse it in a totally different context in a modern song. So it's a way of adapting something that was powerful in the past and rephrasing it in a way that it really makes sense for the future and the present moment that's being written about. Another skill that Sappho had was writing epic similes. So you'll remember similes are when you compare two unlike things using like or as to compare them. And an epic simile is when you do that for a very long time in a poem. And you do that as a way to really suspend emotion, to make a really big emotional point. And in Sappho's poem, she uses the moon as a way to suspend longing. There's a really common phrase again in Homeric epics, and it was used as a way to really remember a really long poem. So Homeric epics, where like the Odyssey and the Iliad, were said aloud. People would go to a party and someone would just say a poem for hours and hours without. It was never written down. It was just retold and retold. So the job of this poet was to remember the poem. So it wasn't Homer who was reading the poem, it was a professional reader who would come in and recite the poem. And one way to remember were these pneumatic devices, like the phrase rosy-fingered dawn would be inserted anytime a new day was beginning. So you'll see, if you read the Odyssey, you'll see the phrase rosy-fingered dawn appears again and again and again, and every time it appears, a new day is starting. So what Sappho does is she refigures this phrase as a symbol of a female symbol. She changes the idea of the sun, which is a male symbol, to the moon, which is a female symbol, and then she uses it to signify desire between women. So she uses rosy-fingered moon as an image that really thinks through. It's suspended. It's this moon that someone's looking up at in Sardis. She's looking up at the moon and thinking that her beloved many, many miles away is also looking up at the same moon. And that moon reflects the longing between the two lovers. So two poets that tried writing like Sappho in the modernist era were Ezra Pound and Richard Aldington. They were working in England, in London, England, and a lot of new Sappho fragments. Now, Sappho wrote between 3rd and 5th century BC, a very long time ago. And much of her work, there were many fragments that were recovered, but a lot of her work had been lost. But in 1906, as part of the Oxyrhynchus expedition to Egypt, a bunch of new fragments were found. They were discovered in Egypt, and they were beginning to be translated and published in the Classical Review, and beginning in June 1909. And all of these poets, including Aldington, Pound, and H.D. Hilda Doolittle, were reading the Classical Review and using them as inspiration for writing their own poems. Aldington writes a poem called To Athos, after the manuscript of Sappho, now in Berlin, where he writes in the manner of Sappho, much in the way that she wrote in the manner of Homer, but he shifts the point of view. So Athos is absent in his poem, and the theme becomes, instead of longing for a lost lover who's also equally alive and an active participant, the theme becomes the loss of a possession. So the lover becomes this possession. Let's see if I can easily switch to my handout. Nope. Bear with me. That's not it. Bear with me. Here we go. Hopefully you guys can see this. To Athos. Athos, far from me and dear Minsaki, dwells in Sardis. Many times she was near us, so that we lived life well, like the far-famed goddess, whom above all things music delighted. And now she is first amongst Lydian women, and as the mighty sun, the rose-fingered moon, beside the great stars, and the light fades from the bitter sea, and in a like manner from the rich blossoming earth, and the dew is shed upon the flowers, rose and soft meadow sweet, and many-colored melanote, many things told are remembered of sterile Athos. I yearn to behold thy delicate soul, to satiate my desire. So you'll notice that in Aldington's version, he's satiating his desire. Athos doesn't actually have a point of view and is actually sterile, right? So it's a really different version. Pound, in his poem is named after one of the words that from Aldington's translation and quotations that he couldn't actually translate, and It's really a blazon, so the beloved in this poem is dissected into pieces. Her soul, her lips, her breasts, the whole of Athos remains restless and ungathered. So finally we get to Amy Lowell's version of Sappho. There's Sappho. Now I wonder, what was Sappho? I know a slender thing about her, that loving she was like a burning birch tree, all tall and glittering fire, and that she wrote like the same fire caught up in heaven and held there, a frozen blaze before it broke and fell. So you'll notice in Amy Lowell's poem, Amy Lowell was an American poet who did not write in England. She was writing in America. And when she discovered Sappho, she didn't discover Sappho through the classical review. She actually first discovered Sappho through translation, a translated version of Sappho. But she read her directly, not through Pound and Aldington. And she really felt an emotional connection to Sappho. And you'll notice that in this poem, Sappho only has one P. That's the French version of the spelling that Amy Lowell used. This poem is called The Sisters, and it's a poem where Amy Lowell addresses three poets, much in the way that Sappho addressed Homer. She writes to Sappho, tries to understand her, but then kind of refigures her to work in her own environment. So, like when she says that loving she was like a burning birch tree, birch trees don't exist in Greece. They exist in New England, which is where Amy Lowell was writing. So she takes the image of Sappho, this burning desire, and puts it in New England, plants it firmly in New England. She does that with several different examples, and she also writes back to Elizabeth Barrett Browning and also Emily Dickinson, which you'll see when you read The Sisters, which is part of the Amy Lowell handout that I'd like you to read. For your, you're also going to be looking at The Letter by Amy Lowell, and the line breaks are bad on this, but there's a version of The Letter in your handout. So in Sappho, Amy Lowell found a poet who wrote to a female beloved. Amy Lowell was also writing to a female beloved, used sensual language, and fearlessly uprooted conventional poetic principles. So things that were accepted, like the idea of the isos theon, the idea of a hero, only a hero could be like a god. Sappho turned that on its head, and Amy Lowell does the same thing. She takes conventions and turns them on their head, so that they can represent what it's like to write like a woman. So for this week's reflection journal, I'd like you to read The Letter and The Sisters by Amy Lowell, and it's in our handout. It's the last thing in this week's content. What are these two poems about, and how does Amy Lowell write in the tradition of Sappho? Please make sure you use quotations to support from the poems, to support what you're saying. This is the only assignment this week, except listening to me. Sorry I was all over the place. I just wanted to be able to refer to the handout. Please also look at the handout while you're listening to this lecture. I know it's too late to tell you that, but hopefully you were. Next week, we're moving on to drama. It's going to be exciting. We're moving on to reading, learning about how to read a play, and we're going to be reading our first play called Trifles. All right, that's it, guys. I look forward to seeing you online.